Great. Well, welcome everybody. As I said before, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jessica Salzwedel. I'm a Senior Program Manager at AVEC, and welcome to COVID-19 GPP Resources, a deep dive for advocates. We're really excited to get started with this session today because we really realized that there were, obviously there's a number of research studies and trials happening around COVID-19 and around pandemic preparedness generally, and a lot of resources coming out, but those resources were focusing on the clinical trial conductors and different stakeholder groups, and we wanted to make sure that advocates realized that there were a number of resources that they could use to really think about stakeholder engagement and engage advocates in these fast-moving trials. And so that is really where we're coming from today, and are looking for feedback from all of you on some of the resources that we'll present, but also on where the gaps are. And so we'll be doing an interactive portion of this meeting today in just a little bit. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers first, and then turn it over to each of them to go through the different materials and talk about, sort of set the stage for this interactive deep dive we'll have later around some of the gaps and needs around these resources and how we could potentially fill those gaps. So first, we have Chilufya Hapango from the Treatment Action Literacy Campaign in Zambia. Chilufya is a longtime advocate for HIV prevention, specifically around prevention for women. She is here to talk with us today about how advocates have traditionally been involved in these processes and her experience as an advocate working with global stakeholders around not just COVID-19, but HIV prevention and the lessons learned that she can share. Then next, we're going to go to Dr. Catherine Slack from the HIV/AIDS Vaccine Ethics Group. Dr. Slack is a clinical psychologist, and she's actually the head of the HIV/AIDS Vaccine Ethics Group based at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She does conceptual and empirical research and resource development specifically around the ethical concerns in clinical trials of HIV prevention modalities, including community and stakeholder engagement. Most recently, she's really focused on the center and the connection between community engagement and improving the community engagement process by focusing on the ethics review committees. So really exciting work, and happy to have Dr. Slack with us today. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Nina Gobat. She's a technical officer at the World Health Organization with a background in health, social science, and behavioral science. Her current role aims to strengthen the response to infectious disease epidemics through the integration and uptake of evidence from the social sciences. This work is conducted through the Community Readiness and Resilience Unit in the World Health Emergencies Program and with the WHO R&D Blueprint team. Nina is the social science focal point for the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, or GOARON, research group, and the WHO focal point, previously the chair of the COVID-19 Research Roadmap Social Science Working Group. And she holds an honorary academic post at the University of Oxford with a PhD in health communication and postgraduate diploma in epidemiology. So we're really excited to have Dr. Gobat here today as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Chilufya first to really give us her thoughts on working with global stakeholders as an advocate. Over to you.
Thank you for having me here, Jess. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For a very long time, issues of research and engagement were only left to researchers as key players, but over time, the status quo has moved, not only for advocates, but as the community at large. Besides, research does not only concern researchers themselves, but also everyone else in the community. From experience, I'm not only an advocate for prevention, but I also wear the hat of being the real face of what research seeks to achieve at the end of the day. I am the end user of all the products that come out of research. And as such, it gives me so much pleasure, not only as an advocate, but as a person who would one day benefit from research. One of the roles that I have been able to engage in, firstly, in Zambia, our research landscape could not be same as everybody else or in other countries, so which sets a very different context. But to start with, as advocates, we have a huge role to play with regards to setting the research agenda. To start with, we play a very critical role in ensuring that stakeholder engagement is as effective as we would want it to be, because after all, we care about our communities. We firstly want to protect our communities. We want to show respect for the community where research is taking place. And how can that happen? Without the voice of us as advocates, these things can only remain as a dream. One other thing I would want to talk about is that as advocates, we've been able through our work, for instance, in the case of talk, we've been able to hold researchers accountable with the work that they are doing using different tools. And this is very important because when you look at how GPP is structured, everyone who's part of the research should be held accountable and the research should be transparent. How then can this be a reality without using some tools like the scorecard to ensure that not only the CAB members, but the researchers themselves also to be held accountable for everything that they're doing during the trials. We've also been able to be a very huge part of mobilizing our communities. This is because we want to see communities that are very active in participating in research processes. In the case of Zambia, we've had a bit of a challenge with regards to research because of one of the experience that we had in Mazabuka. And as such, us as advocates, we've taken it to be a very important role to ensure that we bring in active voices from our communities so that research is not frowned upon. When they hear they're going to do a research in one part of the country, people should not frown upon such progressive information. They need to be very receptive, because only then can we see very active communities in research. There are many lessons that also we've learned from COVID-19. For instance, despite us just trying to use community engagement as a role to be part of research, we also get to understand the communities where we serve. I'll give an example of the myths and misconceptions that people have about vaccines. In Zambia, the uptake of vaccine was very difficult. So as advocates, we took it upon ourselves to say, we have to ensure that we have communities that are research literate. And this can only be achieved if we have programs that aim at targeting community structures like neighborhood health committees, who we sit down with and capacity build them in the research processes, because then it becomes very easy for them to be able to translate the information to the community members who trust them. There's also another example that I would give on the role of advocates. For instance, during the development and the review of the research protocols and other informational materials that needs to be used in the trials, it is our role as advocates to ensure that we review and be part of the development. Now, this is not an easy task. You need to take it upon yourselves as advocates to reach out to research trial sites, the researchers themselves, and sometimes even would-be donors. You'd want to help them see the need of coming up with engagement plans that not only suits the research sites, but also the community at large. I'll give an example on how advocates have been able to change the protocols. I'm sure many of you have heard what could have happened if advocates never intervened during the Moderna trial, if they never took in to review the protocol design, leaving the people living with HIV without access to Moderna if it worked, and without the advocates coming in and changing that, it was going to be very difficult for them to have access to the end product. And as such, it shows how much work the advocates need to put in so that they make sure that all the participants or all the people that deserve to get these products get them. So in Zambia currently, our research funding comes from outside the country. What role then can advocates play? We have a huge role to play as advocates with regards to domestic resource mobilization. And as such, TALC this year has embarked on a journey, including other stakeholders, to try and see how best we can start talking about finding resources for our research agenda as a country, because only then can we have a sustained HIV response. We are also alive to the fact that most of the times, the most documented approach when it comes to engagement is the community advisory boards. But for Zambia, we did a pilot with the POPAT study, which was conducted by Jamboard. During this trial, CSO led a very diverse group of advocates who formed a parallel group to act as a community advisory board. With what results? It was very interesting to see how this new structure brought in a very different aspect on how that research was being conducted and how they interacted with the communities. So that also gives us an example of some of the structures that can be used with regards to having engagements, not only sticking to the traditional CAB structures, because they're not only advantages, but there are also challenges that come with using such structures. And I'm sure many of you on this call are alive to this fact. So I would like to end by saying we are not only advocates, but we have this lived experience with diverse perspectives and the richness that we can bring to research. Another example I would give is the newly formed structure, the African Women Prevention Accountability Community Board. They are trying by all means to engage not only with research trials, but also product developers to ensure that we have access to the prevention options that are out of research. And in that sense, it gives us a reason to try out many other structures through advocates for them to lead on the community engagement aspect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chalufia. That was really great. And I think serves as a really nice segue into what we'll be talking about later in the call today. But now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Slack to begin presenting on the GPP Essentials for COVID.
Great, thanks so much, Jess. I'm just going to say hi to everyone with my camera on, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to switch it off during the talk just to make sure that my bandwidth is okay. So I'm just going to spend about 8 minutes just talking about, or really highlighting one resource that has been developed by AVAC entitled GPP Essentials. And it's really hopefully the hope that this opportunity, this will be an opportunity to really do a deep dive into this resource. Next slide, please. Jess, one more. There should be, where? Okay. Jess, for some reason, it's very pale. The words are very pale. I'll just keep going though while you're fixing that. Okay. As many of you will know, this document was produced in March last year, so it's actually been in the field for 12 months. The resource focuses on trials, as I'm sure many of you know because you would have read it. Occasionally that resource references the term studies, which suggests that it's got a broader focus than clinical trials. However, the recommendations are probably a bit too demanding for low-risk, simple social behavioral studies. So it would seem that this AVAC resource is really talking about clinical trials. The resource largely speaks, thanks Jess, that's great. So on the third point now, the resource largely speaks to sponsors and investigators, which is entirely appropriate, but it has dedicated sections all the way throughout, a subsection entitled For Advocates. And it's really this that I'm going to try and focus on today. So I've consolidated those sections and kind of grouped them for today's talk. Go back, Jess, one, go back again. Back again, perfect, thanks. So it has a dedicated section for advocates, that's point 3. The resource has many strong points, and 2 that come to mind is that it tailors itself really nicely to COVID. So it presents factors that are relevant to COVID, not perhaps unique to COVID, but highly relevant to COVID. So it references background factors like urgency and the need for timeliness, background inequities that put certain groups at risk. It references restrictions, references the dynamism of the prevention and treatment context, its quick evolution, and also the need to coordinate with multiple alliances and collaborations that have sprung up around COVID. So it adapts itself very nicely. It doesn't, in a sense, read in a very generic way, if you like. It's quite specific, which I think is a strength. It also addresses relevant ethics topics like informed consent, standard of prevention, standard of care, risks, and post-trial access. And it shows throughout the document how the substantive ethical concern can be strengthened or improved through engagement. And I think that's another really good strength. It's a familiar approach. As you know, that's how the GPP HIV guidelines are also structured. So in terms of key questions, though, going forward, the 2 that came to mind for me and for Jess and others is, how can this resource be amended to better support advocates who've been working in the field now for a long time? And then what else needs to happen to really help the resource's recommended practices for advocates really come to life? In other words, not to just be on the paper, but can they be realized, and can we start the discussion about that today? Next slide, please, Jess. So let's look very briefly at the recommended practices for advocates that are set out in all the dedicated sections across the document. So the first cluster that's identified, and it's probably very familiar to you, and Chalufa has already referenced this, it's a kind of a set of practices for advocates around reviewing, making inputs, giving feedback, and discussing and being part of discussions. And if you look at the first 3 bullets, this resource really recommends that advocates perform these kind of reviewing, inputting type practices around key documents. Firstly, protocols. Secondly, informed consent forms and materials. And then thirdly, engagement plans and mechanisms. So those 3 are really very, very key in this document. And also recommends that there's an inputting, feedback, discussion type function for really key ethics issues like post-trial access. Next slide, please, Jess. The second set of practices, again, very familiar to people whose core work is advocacy or activism, is a whole lobbying, ensuring pressure, ensuring influence, and mobilizing type function. And the sort of pressure points that are recommended in this document is around resources and budgets. If you look at the first slide, it also recommends ensuring that safety standards and processes for approval and dissemination are not influenced by science politicization, and also has kind of a general basket, basket case for saying prominent issues. So all sort of prominent issues that can be sort of captured in that wide basket would be important for advocates to be involved in and to be sure that they are lobbying around those prominent issues, which is quite abstract, but it leaves it very, very broad for activists to determine. And then, of course, there's quite a lot of recommendations around ensuring global pressure for vaccines. So those last 3 points are all around post-trial access to vaccines by at-risk citizens. Next slide, please, Jess. The third cluster is really around a kind of verification cluster, or ensuring or making sure kind of watchdog type practices. And the resource recommends these for, if you look at the first bullet, really the prevention package. In other words, serving as a watchdog to ensure an agreed COVID prevention package. Secondly, to make sure that people who acquire COVID have access to appropriate treatment and care. And then lastly, around trial-related harm. So this is where the document envisages this kind of role. Next slide, please, Jess. And finally, and this probably goes without saying, the document envisages a whole set of practices around learning, ongoing learning, understanding, etc. So it recommends that advocates understand engagement approaches and that they also stay up to date with a whole lot of AVAC resources and others around this particular very, very rapidly moving field. Last slide, please, Jess. I think it's important to note that this AVAC resource isn't implying that these advocacy practices must be confined or limited to those particular issues. So I think it's just what the resource has chosen to highlight. Certainly, if you read it, the spirit and the tone of the resource is really not restrictive. So thanks very much for your attention, and we really hope that today we can try and start the discussion on how best to refine this resource, but even more importantly, to enable it to come to life for advocates that are working in this space. Thanks very much, Jess. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I think that was a really nice overview of the resource. So Dr. Gabat, I'm just pulling up your slides quickly, and then I'm going to hand it over to you. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jess. Thanks very much. And I'm really delighted to be part of this panel. It's my pleasure to join these conversations, and particularly to learn more about the role of advocates. So I really enjoyed hearing from Chalufa, and I think some of the questions that I have sort of mirror some of those that Catherine put forward in her presentation, which is around, how some of the resources that I will be presenting now today can better accommodate and better reflect some of the challenges in the work that is done by advocates. So the focus of my talk is really is going to be to think about to talk about some of the resources that we've developed within WHO in Geneva, which really can sometimes feel very far removed from the realities of on-the-ground practice. This is work that's happening as part of the R&D Blueprint team, and it aligns with the good participatory practice guidelines that have been developed by that team. And so I'm going to talk a little bit to that, and then I will present the resources, but very much looking forward to your feedback to better understand how we can make sure that these resources meet some of your needs as well. Next slide, please, Jess. So many of you will be familiar with the R&D Blueprint. It's a global strategy and preparedness plan that really allows for rapid activation of research and development during epidemics. It has identified priority diseases, and of course, novel respiratory pathogens is featured on that list. But the main aim of the R&D Blueprint is to fast track and catalyze the development of new tests, vaccines, treatments for diseases that pose a public health risk where there's no or there's insufficient medical countermeasures. So really, these are trials that we kind of anticipate are going to be conducted in fairly sort of emergency context, public health emergency context. So COVID was a key example. This is where the R&D Blueprint team really sprung into action. In 2016, the R&D Blueprint team worked to develop guidelines for good participatory practices for these kinds of trials. But of course, these guidelines drew very heavily on the lessons and the substantive body of work that related to good participatory practices in HIV trials. But again, one of the defining features here is about emergency trials, rapid GPP that happens when trials need to be launched very quickly. And in fact, very often in those kinds of contexts, good participatory practices is one of the areas that can fall by the wayside. It can fall between the cracks. So it's a key area that we really want to keep a very strong focus on to make sure that this does actually happen alongside trials that are being launched in these challenging contexts. So the aim of GPP EP guidelines is really to provide sponsors and research team members with a principle-based guidelines on how to effectively engage multiple stakeholder groups. So we're thinking of, many different stakeholders and throughout the life cycle of the trial. So from the design, the setup phase, through the duration, as well as into trial closure. And at their heart are very well recognized principles that you've heard reflected now in Chalufa's talk, as well as in Catherine's talk, of respect and fairness and integrity and transparency, accountability and autonomy. Of course, the key challenge is how we really realize that in these challenging contexts. And a core rationale for the work is how to strengthen mutual understanding, collaboration and trust, making sure the research is relevant and making sure the processes are acceptable and sensitized to the context in which the research is being delivered. And I really wanted to draw attention to this because this is our frame of reference. This was sort of our starting point for when we were thinking about the work that we kicked off for COVID. The next slide, please, Jess. So at the start of COVID, there was indeed, as we anticipated, a significant amount of investment and activity around research and of course around research for the development of new medical countermeasures. And what we wanted to do was to take the normative guidelines of GPP for emerging pathogens and to develop something that was very practical, very user-friendly, could be picked up and implemented alongside COVID-19 clinical trials. And this was really the thinking that led to these first two resources. The first was a GPP toolbox. The second is a working with community advisory board document, fully taking into consideration Chalufa's reflections around some of the limitations of working with CABs. But nevertheless, in many, many instances, even sort of having a CAB alongside a clinical trial being launched is an important first step. And both of these documents are really, they were informed by practitioners, they're informed by real life experiences, they contain very sort of practical information about delivering GPP alongside clinical trials. They were, though, quite generic, and they're not particularly focused on any particular trial. I think we have circulated these as pre-reads, but if not, then obviously we can circulate them after the webinar. And they're also available on our web page. So Jess, if we could just have the next slide, I can just show folks the web page. And there on the right-hand side, you can see the links to the different documents. You'll also see a link there to the GPP resource for the Solidarity Trial vaccines. Our group has been leading GPP work for that trial, and I'll just talk a little bit to that before finishing my talk. The next slide, please, Jess. So the Solidarity Trial vaccines is an international, individually randomized controlled trial to evaluate promising new vaccines for COVID-19. It's co-sponsored by WHO and health ministries. It's very much led by national teams, but it is a global trial. And the protocol, so it does share the protocol across the different countries where the trial is being delivered. And of course, then the national teams are responsible for implementing that trial sub-regionally and then also locally. We currently have the trial active in 3 countries, in Colombia, the Philippines and Mali. We've recruited over 18,000 participants and we're preparing to launch in an additional 3 countries in the coming months. And our team was tasked with supporting good participatory practices across all participating sites. So we really had to think about how we could do that in a way that would allow for a certain amount of consistency, but then also variability of practice based on the teams that were going to be taking this work forward. So we have done this through 3 key mechanisms. The first was a bespoke onboarding process. Next slide, please, Jess. So for all of our new countries that joined the trial, we have a specific process of engaging with them. We have a national lead who's part of the national trial team, and who's responsible for bringing together their good participatory practice team, responsible for planning their activities, and also for budgeting for GPP. That was a very important piece. And what we do is we engage with those teams, we work with them in a very bespoke and responsive way. We have a series of meetings where we exchange information to understand what their needs are, what their capacities with their capabilities. We had very different teams with very different previous experiences, and of course, working in very different contexts and facing some very different challenges. And we work one-on-one with them to support them, particularly through the early setup phase. The second thing that we've done is develop a suite of tools and resources, and this includes a handbook for GPP EP that again is available on the website. That's got much more detailed information than the toolbox that I presented earlier. We've also got a handbook for crisis communications, so to handle tough situations within trials, and again thinking about before, during, and after the trial, as well as some very practical worksheets, templates that include things like a template for an engagement plan, templates for context and environment scanning, for stakeholder mapping, budget templates, terms of references for community advisory boards, facilitation guides for running focus groups or town hall meetings, forms for tracking rumors, concerns, anxieties, and so on. And some of these materials have really been developed based on needs. So the teams an issue will come up in our one-on-one sessions, and then we will support them to develop materials. And often when we are developing materials, we have an eye to make sure that those materials can then be shared across the other national teams as well. We've also developed a whole range of other study-specific tools as well, things like flipbooks and leaflets and so on. And again, when a team comes on board, we then work with that team to make sure that those materials are context-specific, they're adapted, they're adjusted, they are translated into local languages, and so on. And then the final mechanism that we work through is our global coordination mechanism. And this is really where we bring all of our national teams together on one call. We meet weekly, and it's an opportunity to exchange and to learn from each other. And it's particularly rich in terms of thinking about the common challenges actually that are faced across very different contexts. This is a very difficult trial to deliver. It's being delivered in a dynamic context, in a protracted public health emergency, with emergence of new variants, changing public policies, differing impacts of these policies on the lives and livelihoods of affected populations. And that, of course, also impacts the extent to which some of these folk want to be involved or engaged in the trial. We have competing clinical trials that are happening at the same time. We have varying policies, varying availabilities to COVID-19 vaccines. And so having a space where these groups can come together and exchange their experiences has been very rich indeed. So now with that global coordination mechanism in place, any new teams coming on board can join those conversations. The final thing that we do have is an online learning program that will go live shortly. It's not ready to be launched for today, unfortunately, but as soon as that is ready, we will make that available. At this stage, it is also focused on good participatory practices for the trial, Solidarity Trial vaccines, but we have plans to make that a more generic training as well. This final slide is to acknowledge the many, many people who've been involved in this work up until this point, but I'm going to stop there and happy to take any questions. And of course, very happy and curious to hear feedback around what we're missing in terms of really making sure that we are properly engaging with the needs and the work of advocates as we move forward with this work. But thanks very much, Jason, over to you.
Great, thank you all. I think that really is a nice segue into what we hope to be a really interactive piece of the meeting today, is to get feedback from everybody. So on all of these sessions, so I am dropping in a link to a Jamboard, which for those of you who may not be familiar with it, you do need to click on it. It's going to take you to an online tool, and I'm going to share that now with everybody so that you can all see what that looks like and just get a preview. So it will take you here to this Jamboard piece, and from there you'll be able to go over to this piece here. It says sticky note. You can click on that and begin to type in your feedback to the questions that we have here. And so we're going to spend a few minutes on each of the boards, again, trying to digest everything that we just saw and read. So I think as advocates on the call, I know some of you are part of the COVID Advocacy Advisory Board. Others have just been advocates in this space, really trying to hear what are your challenges, what are your needs working in this space. So I see many of you have come over, which is great. So again, we can drop the chat in, and for those who might be on the phone or unable to access the Jamboard for whatever reason, we do encourage you to bring your voice into this space, or to feel free to drop it into the chat feature on Zoom, and I can get that over to you. So again, in order to post a note, you're going to click on the sticky note here, and what has been your experience, and maybe it's a lack of resources around communication. Again, this is just an example, and then that would go up on the sticky note here on the board, and so you can move it around. This is a completely anonymous board, so you should feel free to type in whatever, whatever answers you have. Again, it is an anonymous space. So you just come over, you click on the sticky note, and you can go ahead and type something in there. Again, if you are unable to because of technology or just some challenges getting over, we understand bandwidth issues, please feel free to type it into the regular chat here on Zoom, or raise your hand and bring your voice into the space. But very curious to hear, what are some of your reflections on the needs advocates have working in this space? Great. I'm going to see some answers popping up. And if anybody feels like they want to come off mute, you should feel free to bring your voice into this space. I heard a lot of really sort of this idea that, thinking about Kathy's analysis of the document and this need for sort of watchdogging, or making sure that there is mobilization as a key theme. I was in looking through some of the solidarity materials and around GPP, I wonder if that's something that I saw as a potential need for resources there, especially after hearing what Chalufia was saying, that that's really a bridge that advocates can play and have played, as we all know, in this space in the past, being able to connect the research to the implementation side. So the need to mobilize around not just resources to actually pay for whatever the intervention is, but also mobilizing support for that within government organizations, and really being able to have flexibility that perhaps a site staff member can't have. And so that seemed to me to be a really interesting piece that I saw there. So we're going to spend maybe just another minute. Lack of resources and information for advocates to mobilize community CSOs. Thanks, Sylvia. We're going to put that into a sticky note so that we have that for later. So I'm seeing some really great themes kind of emerge here. So many vested interests to be aware of. I'd love if there's any thoughts to expand, if anybody would like to raise, to maybe expand on some of these topics. Yeah, I think this is a big challenge, how to keep engagement going for non-COVID trials, even while COVID trials are essential. Great. So this new bullet that came in, ensuring that resources are tailored to advocates and not just community. I'm wondering if somebody can expand on that a bit more. I think that that's a really helpful point. But I wonder if somebody can expand, what is it that advocates need that's maybe separate from general community? Anybody want to expand on that? It doesn't just have to be the person who wrote it. I'm wondering if others might feel that.
If I may respond to that, Philista here.
I feel straight, please.
So I think ensuring that resources are tailored to advocates and not just the community. If we capture the platform of advocates and ensure that they are equipped in terms of capacity building and they know what they are supposed to share with the communities. And we know very well that with COVID, we had myths and misconceptions. Then advocates could be very good champions who could go and address these myths and misconceptions. And also we should have some sort of capacity building in terms of training that targets advocates to empower them to be able to confidently respond to the questions that communities come up with, and also tackle issues on the social media, because with COVID, we had a lot of misinformation through the social media. So advocates will be key in addressing these issues. And also this goes with funding. So if they can be empowered in terms of maybe having some little funds that can be given to advocates to get deep inside the community and address this issue. Thanks.
Great, Phil. So I think you hit on a couple of really key points there, which is, you know, there are materials out there around communication and different ideas on how to combat maybe rumors and misconceptions. But I think, you know, what you're saying is that advocates maybe play this unique role, and this idea that messaging that doesn't come from a trial site is actually really important. So having maybe a toolkit just for advocates with messaging strategies or social media pieces that you can easily pump into a WhatsApp or something, it could be a really good resource to have. And maybe understanding the voice as well, like who is it that's saying the information, and maybe that changes whether you're an advocate or at a trial site. So I think that those are really great distinctions as well. I think the other piece you mentioned too, just wanted to bring this in before we move to the next board, was this idea of funding. I think, again, this supporting and sustaining advocates' roles and all the many mechanisms, and Chaloufia listed a few really great examples of, you know, different advisory boards, but coming from an advocacy perspective that have the ability and flexibility to really move between working with the trial site, working with local government organizations, and then working with product developers. So really moving through the variety of groups to ensure that it's all there. So I know we're running out of time, so I want to make sure that we get to our last two boards. So the next question is, you know, what resources are needed to strengthen advocates' work in this space? You know, I know that some of you just put some of those materials that were really needed and some of the gaps there, and maybe even we can just spend a few minutes on what are some of the resources. And Phyllis just mentioned some additional trainings that might be really useful for advocates to have, some sustained funding. But are there other resources that we feel like could be useful to strengthen advocates' work in this space? And one of the things I was thinking around the communication is really this piece about vaccine hesitancy. Is that something that could be a useful resource to strengthen advocates' work in this space, to have materials specific around specific issues? Yes,
Hi, everyone.
Oh, hello.
This is Peter from Kenya. I'm sorry, I had a problem with technology, and I'm really getting excited about this topic as I was reading the Jamboard and your last question. I just wanted to chip in that that the other resource that the advocates need is to build their capacity in terms of getting new information. So if you build their capacities, they are able to access or do rapid results research, then that can also help in as a resource, so that they're up to date with either technology or like if we are asking for funding, we know how much is the funding gap, so that we have the right information to push the advocacy agenda. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Really great points to bring into this space. I'm going to just spend a few more minutes on this board, and then we want to spend, at least 5 minutes on the last board, which is really focused on some of the WHO materials that we saw, again, both for the pre-read and that Nina mentioned in her talk. I did drop it in the chat, but we'll do so again, just so that everybody has the link to the WHO site and can access these GPP materials. But great, again, I think resources can be a lot of things, and I really love this idea that we're mostly connecting via internet. So support for connection, obviously, is a really important one. Also, just to say on this piece, I think that how quickly the world is evolving and maybe moving in between both online connections and phone connections, but also going in between in-person connections again as well. So maybe what's needed to sustain engagement as we move through and now are adapting to the different ways that we're engaging with groups, and as advocates, kind of having to again have that fluidity between sometimes we're going to host some online literacy training events and sometimes communicating and responding to rumors via WhatsApp. And so having, or other social media platforms, and really having that flexibility of resources and capacity, I think, Peter, to your point, to kind of move through and in between all of those spaces. So maybe just moving on to the last question, just to make sure that we get this space. I think the question here is really critical, and really, how could the WHO assist advocates working in this space? I think there was a number of really strong resources that Nina previewed, and again, were sent through with the pre-reads, but really want to be critical about how the WHO can help assist advocates who are working in this space. And I think just to make sure that we're bringing in Kathy's question from earlier, which is, not just the resources on the page, but how can we help facilitate bringing those actions to life and really actualizing all of those elements.
Yeah, thank you. I'm one of the people as representing community as at the Act A, and we have a number of pillars and quite hundreds of CSOs working in different pillars and working groups. But one of the things that most of the civil society organizations have faced the challenge of support in terms of due to COVID, we have had hundreds and hundreds of meetings. In a week, you can have as much as 20 meetings, and these are not supported by data. And these are people who probably have given out themselves to work. And it takes time. A meeting that lasts about 2 hours means you have the regular duty that you do, you have to abandon them to do so. There's need for some kind of support and solidarity with civil society who give out their time to do research, to gather information, to interject or to contribute to the discussions in the pillars, different pillars or different principles group meetings that take that is hundreds of hours a week, and that sacrifice somebody should be able to appreciate and support that contribution.
Great, thank you, Peter, for bringing that into the space. I think that's definitely something that, as many of us have, or we all have really switched to this online platform, this idea of making sure that advocates and these other engagement mechanisms are recognized as not just legitimate, but also as a starting point for engagement, right? So that it's not always from the site out, but that they can come from an advocacy group in, or from the community to a product developer. And really, I think what this pandemic has really also shifted is not just the way we engage, but the way we think about the sort of center of engagement. And that's really beginning to shift in its recognition of importance, but not always in its recognition of providing resources to that. So I think that was a really great piece to bring into this space. Yeah, I think so. I just want to bring this point out verbally. So Kate Hankins, who was one of the original authors actually of the of the GPP EP Emerging Pathogens Guidelines, the 2016 version, as well as really a guiding light on the good participatory practice guidelines. Generally, the 2007 and 2011 versions that UNAIDS and AVAC put out, just put into the chat, there's a real need to collect experiences, barriers, and facilitators for implementation so that we can continue the learning. I think that's really true. And one of the things that struck me about Nina's conversation was this idea of these weekly calls and a platform that sites have to, or teams have, right, to gather experiences and share, and that advocates, might need something like that, as well as they are collecting these experiences and, have been implementing GPP. So really excited to both see that point in the chat and also I think hear it echoed in the conversations there.
Hi Jess, maybe I can just pop in and sort of just add to that. So yes, and completely take the point. Kate, thank you so much for the comment. And we do actually have Ilya Ormel at the moment on the call, and she is doing exactly that. She's capturing the lessons learned from the barriers and the facilitators. We've also just done a rapid evidence review, sort of trying to capture what has already been published, but there's not a huge amount that's been published in this space, particularly related to COVID, barriers and facilitators, GPP implementation. So I think we do need to better understand people's experiences, and to bring the voice of advocates into that space would be very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's really exciting to hear, and we'd love to learn how to get more involved in that process, and I think make sure that we keep that connection going. I think there are some members in the call today who are part of a COVID advocacy advisory board. I think that would be a nice connection to think about how they are really engaging in this space fully. Yeah. So I know we're getting to the top of the hour. We do encourage folks to continue to put into the Jamboard, and we will get all of these questions or all of these comments consolidated, and we'll be able to provide this out. Any others or anybody else who want to bring anything into this space, just to share their voice and to share some of their experiences or what they think, advocates and how the WHO could assist advocates working in this space?
Yeah, thank you. Let me just jump in with the last remark regarding that advocacy has meaning if there is meaningful engagement and then their voice is heard. There's one thing to advocate for participation, but there's a difference when your voices has not heard, and that sometimes we, as advocates, we have issues or we have frustrations when we try to voice something to the WHO or any other principles in the COVID response, for example, and your voices are not heard. An example is where we try to push on the self-testing rapid test, antigen tests, and it took quite a number of months and argument and looking for evidence for WHO to release the guideline, because we felt a rapid test is being used in global north, but in the global south, it is not acceptable because we don't have pre-qualified or whatever it is. There were all sorts of excuses. So my point is that apart from resources, we also advocates need enabling environment so that you are encouraged to voice your concerns, and there's somebody to listen to you, other than if the environment is not conducive or is not enabled, then the advocates end up talking to themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really great point, Peter. I just want to thank you for bringing that into the space. Stacey, I see that you have your hand up. I'm going to give you the last point before we close out.
Gosh, that's such pressure. I was just actually going to thank you. I was going to make, here, I'll turn my video on. I was just actually going to make a quick point just to say thank you for bringing this together, and thanks for just a great kind of overview, and really interested to hear, I think, some of the lessons about kind of implementing these WHO tools, and you know, just really echoing, I think, Kate's sentiment around you know, really sort of coming together and collecting some of these experiences. And I think we all on this call know the challenges of implementing GPP and participatory practice in research, and certainly that has been even more challenging, I think, potentially with COVID. So I think the more we can collaborate, the stronger this work all gets. I really actually was just going to make a very quick point that one of the things that we were really thinking, you know, we were really thinking about this in writing the GPP Essentials document, and maybe just to kind of go back to, you know, what can be helpful for, you know, advocates as, you know, as research like COVID research kind of moves forward the way it did move forward. I think we all sort of saw that happen so rapidly. And we knew that the research needed to happen rapidly, but we knew that communities needed to be involved, but, you know, this sort of challenge of wanting the research to move forward rapidly, and not wanting to slow it down by putting some kind of onerous, you know, community engagement mechanism on top of it. And that was really kind of why we wrote the GPP Essentials the way we did, with that specific piece around, you know, this is the role for stakeholders, and for advocates. And it might be interesting, you know, I think that if we want to sort of go back and see how useful something like that is in kind of a rapid response, you know, rapid research kind of a setting, we could maybe do even like some focus grouping around the, you know, that piece specifically of the Essentials document. But did just want to sort of point that out in the conversation about what are the sort of the resources that advocates need in contexts like you know, community engagement and stakeholder engagement in COVID research and other emerging pathogens. So just a specific point, but maybe just to say thank you. Jess, I'll hand it to you for the last word.
Well, I just really want to say thank you to our panelists today, to Kathy Slack, to Nina Gobet, and to Chilufya Fungo, who've just been absolutely phenomenal. I think gave us so much food for thought. I do want to give everybody just one word quickly. I know we're at the top of the hour. Just a last word. I'm going to start with, we'll go in the order. So just Chilufya, any last thoughts or comments from you?
I'm so happy we're having this conversation. I would like to see it translate to action and make sure that we not only dream, but we live the reality that we seek to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity and for all the participation. I think we're just in quite a strong place. I think we've identified some of the key issues we need to take forward in an ongoing conversation. We have GPP being elevated in a big global COVID trial. We've got a huge new slew of resources to review and to write comments on. So I think there's a lot of work ahead, but I think we're actually in quite a strong place, and I think we're in a good position to get even stronger. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be involved.
Thank you. And Nina, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I echo those words. It's been really, really important and exciting to be part of this conversation, to learn more about the role of advocates, and to be thinking a little bit more a focused way about how we can make sure that our materials better serve your needs. I would be very interested to connect with your advocacy advisory board. So let's have this be the start of a conversation and see how to take it forward. Thanks very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And thank you all for your time and energy today. As I mentioned, we'll send through the recording as well as the resources that were presented. So have a wonderful day all.